You are listening to Panther Tracks.
Because of the following special program, Wonder Woman and the Incredible Hulk will not be presented this evening.
It's time to get all your Star Wars news in a single file. This is Making Tracks. Here are your hosts, Mark Newbold and Mark Mulcaster.
That's not true. That's impossible.
You're listening to Making Tracks and a very special episode where we catch up with animation supervisor Hal Hickel from ILM. We talk about his Star Wars career, starting with the Phantom Menace all the way through to the Mandalorian. So we'll get straight into it. Sit back and enjoy our conversation with Hal Hickel. When you went from Pixar to ILM, your first big project was Lost World, which was a huge project. Even compared to Jurassic, it was a huge project 4 years on. And then you dive straight into Phantom Menace, first Star Wars film for 16 years as it was at the time. How was ILM set at that point? Was there a huge... I mean, we saw Disney Gallery with you guys talking around the table, with Favreau talking about it, you know.
Yeah.
Was there that huge sense of excitement that Star Wars is back in town and we're working on it?
Oh, yeah. That's why I left Pixar to go to ILM. I'd always wanted to work at ILM. It had been a goal, since childhood, really. But Pixar was great. I loved it there. Toy Story was a hit. And Pixar was a great place to be. So it wasn't a slam dunk that, and you have to understand, physically, Pixar and ILM were a 10-minute drive apart. So they were quite near each other. So I was finally living, near this place that I'd always wanted to work. But I was at another company that, Pixar, which was amazing. But what, made me think, all right, I've got to try it. I've got to try and get it on at ILM if I can, was A, they were making sequel to Jurassic, and B, they were getting ready to make more Star Wars films, which is already known at that point and been announced. So if I'm ever going to do it, I've got to try it now. And I had a reel of shots from Toy Story on my demo reel then, so I thought, the timing is right. But so the excitement, I think, throughout the whole company was similar to mine, which was like, I can't wait to work with George on a Star Wars movie. I never thought I'd be able to do that. And now, here it is. It's going to happen. And so the excitement was palpable. It was also quite daunting, though, because George was talking about a movie that was going to have over 1,000 visual effect shots. Nowadays, or maybe close to 2,000. I forget what number was. Yeah, 2. And that was unheard of. I mean, at that point, 1995, 1996, a really big visual effects movie, 500 shots was still considered a massive visual effects movie. I mean, when you consider Jurassic Park, which had only been 4 years before, only had about, I think, fewer than 50 digital dinosaur shots in it. And that was a massive undertaking then. So, you go 4 years later and now people are making films with hundreds of visual effects shots. And that's a giant, massive, complicated, difficult project. And now George wants to make a film with thousands of visual effects, digital visual effects shots. So that was, everyone was really wondering how that was going to work out.
Yeah.
But, fortunately, folks like John Knoll, John is great at tackling big, intractable, what seem like intractable problems. He's very good at analyzing and breaking down the problems into smaller problems, small enough that you begin to understand how to move forward. He's super good at that, amongst a lot of other things. That's one of the reasons I've always really enjoyed working with John on big, complicated, difficult projects like the Pirates films. We had lots of different problems to solve, and John's just very good at organizing and figuring out how to break down those problems into smaller problems and to delegate to the right people and all that. So, yes, the excitement on Phantom Menace was palpable when I got there. Like, everybody was just completely chomping at the bit to make another Star Wars movie for George.
What was your big involvement on Phantom?
I came on as an animator. So initially I was doing things like I did a little bit of exploratory animation on the pit droids, and then Rob Coleman, the animation director on the 3 prequels, he put me on some shots of Watto. So when he's saying the little bit about, I'm a Toydarian, mind tricks don't work. What do you think? You're some kind of Jedi? I'm a Toydarian, mind tricks don't work on me. I did those shots, and although I believe Linda Bell was the lead on Watto. Anyways, and then George, he knew I liked robots, so he gave me the droidicas, the destroyer droids that roll up in a ball. And so I did the animation of those guys rolling in and unfolding. I did some Stampede creatures in the Stampede where they first meet Jar Jar. And then Rob gave me a bump up to be a character lead for Boss Nass, the king of the Gungans. So I did a bunch of shots, and I had a little group of animators helping me with all the Boss Nass shots. And I kind of did some key shots up front, figured out his mannerisms and stuff, and then we all just worked together on all the shots of him. I think that's mainly it. I can't remember doing any other. I didn't do any pod race stuff or. Anyways, I think those were my main goals. So that was, the project where I moved from animator up to lead animator, but those were my main duties on Phantom Menace.
Fantatrax.
Moving on to episode 2 then, given that you probably started on episode 2 around about 2000 there or thereabouts, it felt like a huge, just visually, the scope of that film, the depth of the film, what's going on felt immense. So for you guys, again, it always felt to me like the one film where you really were chasing to stay with it because there was so much going on in the plot, and so much to convey on the screen. How was it with Attack of the Clones? Was it that kind of film that you really just had to go for it full bore?
Yes, it was Rob who was the anim director on the 3 films. Yeah. In fact, he decided that he was going to need some help on Attack of the Clones. After Phantom Menace, I got my first chance to be in Anim Soup, which was on AI. And so I'd finished that. Clones was already underway, and Rob asked me to come on to Clones as kind of an undersuit. He would still be the animation director, and then there'd be me and Chris Armstrong were his two Anim Soups. So he would just kind of divvy up the show and give us a sequence and say, all right, take this and get it done. Yeah. And so I came in, a little bit midstream in a way. The film was already going. But one of the first things Rob handed me was this Droid Factory thing, which which had some pretty goofy gags in it and stuff. Which that for me was the quintessential sort of like, I'm not sure like there were ideas in there. Like the whole gag with C-3PO getting his head knocked off and replaced with a droid head and stuff. I thought it was a bit silly. But, that's that thing where you're like, even if this isn't exactly your, what you would do with this moment, you've got to bring your skills to bear. And I was still pretty green then. I look at some of that work now and think, ooh, I should have done this or I would have advised that. But still, it's a great experience. And the really fun part and difficult part of that sequence was the whole assembly line machines that Padme runs through, because George was keen for them to make a kind of sense. He didn't care overly about it. Maybe we cared about it more than he did, actually. But we were at least keen that they be doing something. And what they were doing was stamping out the breastplates for the super battle droids. So if you actually watch carefully across the sequence, it starts with just a raw ingot, and it gradually gets shaped and stamped and drilled and grinded until it's this recognizable chess piece for the super battle droid as it moves down the assembly line. And then, syncing up the green screen plates so that were just insane. You'd had poor Natalie Portman running around on these green treadmills, ducking and jumping under things. It was nuts. It was absolutely nuts. And we had to kind of make sense of it and design machines that would serve that action. Well, Doug Chang designed the scenes, just the machines, but we had to bring his designs together with what was in the place to kind of actually make a sort of sense out of it. And that was actually really fun. It was a super difficult sequence, though, because it was changing all the time. It had been added quite late in the process. And so all the different parts of it, the smelting pots that carried around on those winches above, and there's action in and out of those and all over these conveyor belts, and with these flying Geonosians that pop in with their sonic weapons or whatever they are. And it was crazy. And plus, Billy Brooks animated the flying R2-D2. It's another idea that some of us we're like, is it really a good idea to say that R2-D2 can fly? But I love George. That's the thing. Even when there was stuff that I'd be like, I'd kind of shrug and think, well, that might not have been my choice. I always loved working for George. I still admire him massively, and I really enjoyed working for him on that film.
Hello, I'm Ahmed Best, and you're listening to Fantatrax.
Obviously, you did the 2 prequel movies. You didn't do Star Wars again until Rogue One. Again, hugely popular film. People adore that movie, increasingly so as the years go by. What was your involvement in Rogue One?
I was the animation supervisor. It was maybe my 7th film together with John Knoll. So, any creatures or droids certainly that are CG, and then also spaceships and things that move around in that way. So super fun. I mean, I feel like I've gotten really quite lucky in recent years to work on Rogue One and now Mandalorian. They're both firmly rooted in the timeline of the original trilogy. And so for me, they've just been hugely fun to work on. I mean, the sequel films are great. I've really enjoyed watching each of those as they came out, but I've really had almost nothing to do with them. So I've been able to enjoy them just as an audience member, really. Yeah. But I feel tremendously lucky to have been involved with Rogue. And Rogue as well, because it was John's idea. He pitched the idea to Kathy for Rogue One. John Knoll did. And so, it's like, yay, one of our own, And I love the whole idea of it. And working with Gareth was awesome. He's great. Because there are a lot of components of what makes an experience working on a film, good or bad. You've got the actual experience of making it and what the people were like that you worked with and those relationships, and then the work itself, how connected to it you feel, and then of course the response after the fact. And Rogue was one of those, awesome projects where I couldn't have asked for a better crew. It was an amazing group of people to work with. I loved the project itself and everything that was in it. I really enjoyed working with Gareth, and then the film had a great reception afterwards. So in every way, it was kind of a home run for me. I really loved it. We had K2SO to do. We had certainly a big space battle at the end, odd little creatures here and there. Like the sequel films, though, there was a real desire to do things practically wherever possible, which I applaud. I think that's the way to go, and let us do the rest. So that was great. Neil Scanlon's group did amazing creature work on it as always, and we got to do things like K2SO, and that was super fun. It was to contribute participate in contributing a new droid to the Star Wars canon is amazing. And Alan Tudyk is super funny, and he was great and perfect for the role. And, just thought that whole experience was really fun. Plus doing a character that's really tall, but actually having him on set doing the character. So he's up on these stilts was really wacky sort of approach that was great. It was the right approach, but it was, kind of nutty to put an actor up on these stilts. Alan was great with it. So. Yeah, it was a great project.
Hi, this is Gareth Edwards, director of the best standalone Star Wars film since Caravan of Courage, called Rogue One. You're listening to Panther Tracks. Enjoy.
It strikes me that ILM as a company were there taking optical effects to the nth degree as they did up until the digital era starts, and then they finesse that. And now you come onto the Mandalorian with the whole stagecraft technology, which I guess for you guys is another level of working things out. Given the limited knowledge that we have of what it is and how it works, and we're seeing it on Disney Gallery right now, because it seems to be shot in the room. It goes back to you saying about rear screen projection earlier, and it feels like the modern version of rear screen projection in that it's there in the room. So how does ILM do their work off the back of that?
I think the fundamental thing for the visual effect artist that changes with using what we call the volume, is that a lot of the environment work has to be created ahead of shooting. Generally, we're doing that all in post-production, where the actors have been shot on green or blue screens, and then we're adding in some environment, the fantastical alien planet, whatever environment. But now those things have to be designed and agreed upon and created ahead of shooting so that they can be displayed on the walls of the volume. So that's a big change. It moves a lot of creative decisions up front. I mean, honestly, it's not a lot different than regular live action filmmaking, in the sense that with regular live action, you have to decide what the set looks like in time to get it built, in time to, shoot your actors on it. But with visual effects, people are kind of used to deferring a lot of creative ideas until post. And now a big chunk of those decisions have to be made up front, which I think is a good thing and committed to. For my part of it, though, as, animation supervisor, where I'm dealing with, creatures and things, my work is largely the same as it's been for feature films or films before the volume was created, in the sense that we're starting to do a little bit of it now, but we really haven't used it to display creatures. So in other words, there aren't creatures I have to get built and animated and performing ahead of the live action shooting so that they can be part of the imagery that's on the volume walls. Yeah. I'm still largely creating, whether it's IG-11 or the blurgs or what have you, creating those in post-production well after shooting's finished. That said, I'm looking forward to using the volume for some interesting creature things, like, and this is not anything that's on the books for me or anything, but just we've been talking about it at work. Like an interesting version of that might be that in a nearby motion capture stage, or maybe right next to the volume on a motion capture stage, you might have a motion capture actor that is driving in real time some 15-foot tall creature that's being rendered live and put onto the volume. So the actors on the volume can see that 15-foot tall creature moving opposite them, and they can follow it with their eyes and watch it as it moves. That to me is kind of an exciting thing, because that's always been an example of something that's always been a little tough to get right, where you've got a giant or a kaiju or even just a 10 or 15 foot tall creature that's interacting with a live actor in an environment. Usually you've got somebody on set with a pole with a tennis ball at the top of it that you're telling them to look at, and now they would actually be able to see this creature and see it performing, because the motion capture performer can be not just creating a moving marker for them to look at, but actually performing something for them to react to. And so that's exciting. I look forward to that kind of thing, but that hasn't been part of my experience with the volume so far. I've seen it creating environments for us. The Roost environment last year, and that sort of floating chop shop hangout that Mando visits in the heist episode. Yeah. We did have some digital extras in the background of those loads, of those environments where, way in the background, there'd be some figure back there welding or walking along a catwalk or something. So that's as close as I've gotten so far to creating a sort of digital character animation on the volume, but it's coming. I'm sure we'll be doing some of that soon.
I spoke to Brian Herring recently and talking about operating BB-8 and all the technological advances that him and Scanlan and that team had made operating it better. And he was very impressed with all the advances in that respect. Ultimately, it all came down to anything that makes the performance more real and in the moment and feel organic and natural. It strikes me what you've sort of said about the possibilities of stagecraft and what ILM are doing in concert with it will only make the performances feel more organic and real.
Yeah. And that's one of there are a bunch of advantages to shooting on the volume. And of course, it's not suitable for everything. There's always going to be a need to go out to real locations and all that kind of thing. Yeah. But for situations where there is not a real location, like an alien planet, for instance, it's great to immerse the actors and give them something to react to and bounce off of, both in terms of their acting, but also in terms of visually what you get on screen, because remember, they're completely surrounded by this giant LED screen, and so it's lighting them. And that's the other thing that's always been tricky to get right with green screen and blue screen shoots, is lighting the actors in a way that you hope will match them well into the background you're going to create later. And that there are very good and many good skilled examples of that where people don't even know they're looking at a visual effect. But then, we all know that there are examples where something looks a little bit off and they look a little bit pasted into the scene. And if you're shooting them on the volume, they're essentially being lit by the volume. So if there's a blue sky on the volume above them, you're going to get that kind of bluish skylight. If the, terrain around them is kind of a reddish clay, then you're going to get color from that. And that really is one of the things that makes it look very real, not like a composite. And especially when you get a character like the Mandalorian who's wearing shiny armor the whole time. The reflections you get are just incredibly realistic. So there's both of those advantages. You get more realism out of their performance. Their reaction to it is real. And then you get also just a much more realistic look. But again, I certainly don't want to see everything for the end of time shot that way. I like going on locations and finding real places, and that's always going to be a part of filmmaking too. But the volume has really solved a lot of problems for us, particularly when you consider that we're trying to create a TV show and the requirements of that. That's always been daunting for a show like Star Wars, for a property like Star Wars, to try and do a live action TV series has always been daunting because of the crazy locations you need to depict that can't be filmed just at a normal earthbound location and that sort of thing.
It's obviously it's a new technology and you're still learning it, and everybody's sort of getting used to it being in their wheelhouse now. And we look back a few years to when everybody was talking about a live action Star Wars TV series when George was still running the company, and how far down the line that may or may not have got, the Grady Ranch and all that stuff that was being talked about. Presumably at that point it wasn't feasible financially, technologically, but now it is. does it feel like completely the sky's the limit?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, when I look at the stuff we're doing, and you know, I know I can't talk about what it is, but when I look at the stuff we're doing in season 2 versus season 1, I'm pretty amazed.
Yeah.
And it's just we're just gonna keep refining it and figuring out new ways to use it. And there's been a lot of cool things about it, you know, the volume, but then also kind of going in the other direction where we use some really old school techniques like motion control and miniatures on the show, which was really fun to do with the Razor Crest.
Yeah.
I'm Anthony Daniels, and you are listening to Panther Tracks. Well done.
You obviously want it to feel like we're still at the back end of the OT, but give it a new flavour. What's the sort of mindset on how the look all comes together?
In terms of the look, I'd say the concerns are pretty similar to Rogue in that we're mindful of the proximity to the original trilogy. We, of course, have Doug Chiang in the Lucasfilm art department, you know, designing things and keeping us in the right zone. And then, of course, we have folks like Dave Filoni who have a font of knowledge about the original trilogy and a real strong connection to George to also keep us on track about a lot of things. But I think the thing that makes Mandalorian different is Jon Favreau's sensibility about Star Wars and what he appreciates and likes to see. For instance, one of the things he really enjoys doing is taking a character that might have gotten a few seconds of screen time in the original trilogy, like IG-88, and creating a new character, IG-11, but is that same model of droid, or Ugnaughts, also seen briefly in Empire Strikes Back. Now we've got Quill, who's front and center, a main character in season 1. So that's something he enjoys doing, is sort of raising things out of not obscurity exactly, because certainly for serious fans of the films, they're familiar with all these things, but maybe for casual fans of the series, he's raising them from obscurity, and certainly taking underdeveloped or underused characters and creatures and things and bringing them and putting them front and center. So that's super fun, and it gives you a way to be both familiar and new at the same time. And then, of course, you know, we're creating brand new characters as well and new stories and seeing new corners of the galaxy, which is always fun. It's very much why I loved working on Rogue One. It had one foot firmly rooted in original trilogy costumes and places and vehicles and creatures, and then at the same time there were lots of things in it that were very fresh, not the least of which was Gareth's directing style and Greg Fraser's cinematography, which were very un-original trilogy in a lot of ways. To me, that's an exciting playground to be in, where you kind of get the best of both worlds of doing, you know, your favorite old nostalgic things, but also getting to break new ground and do something fresh. So super fun. So likewise with Mandalorian, you know, and the music as well. I think it was a very brave choice not to, in Mandalorian, not to have music that, you know, frankly sounds like John Williams music, which we all, of course, love and identify strongly with the original trilogy. So I think it was quite a brave choice to decide to make that aspect of this something entirely its own, and I think it's been really successful. I love that.
That's a really good point, because, like you say, the music is so... I mean, now the music's in our head. It couldn't feel and be more Star Wars. So when you're doing the work that you guys do, you want to tell brand new stories, but those touchstones of familiarity are going to bring the casual viewer in. They're going to make people like me pop because it's a bit droid. Oh, we're at Doctor Bay 35 as it was instead of 94, but, you know, we're on Tatooine, and all the cool things that we see seems to work for everybody.
And we have, as you'd imagine, constant conversations about, you know, is this Star Wars? And that can come up around anything. Like if there's a new weapon and the way the weapon's blaster color looks or you know, or what it does, we're constantly talking about, you know, does this feel Star Wars? Does this seem like a Star Wars thing? Because to be sure, there are things that feel, or even just shot design, for instance, especially when we're talking about spaceships and things, there's definitely an aesthetic to the shot design in original trilogy that is different from, for instance, Star Trek.
Yeah.
Star Trek has a completely different aesthetic that is very much its own, and it can sometimes be a little hard to know which one you've tapped into until everyone starts talking about it, and then usually someone is able to put their finger on it and say, you know what, I'll tell you why this is feeling a little off. It's because of, you know, this, that, and the other. And we have these conversations endlessly about pretty much everything on the show. Even dialogue, is thought of through that lens quite frequently.
It's a tricky thing to define, isn't it? Because as a casual viewer, you know when it doesn't quite feel right. You guys, your hairs go up in the back of your neck when you suddenly think that doesn't quite feel right.
We did a little exercise on Rogue One where it was not really part of Rogue One, but it was associated with the fact that we were working on, numerous new Star Wars projects at the time. So Dennis Muren and a few others kind of spearheaded a little project where they took shots from the original trilogy, all three films. For instance, if it was a Star Destroyer shot from Empire Strikes Back, they'd take that shot and then they'd add a second Star Destroyer using the asset that we built for Rogue One and do everything they could to match the look and lighting and everything to the practical one, the miniature one that was in the shot already. Not as a way to sort of fool anyone. It was more just as a way to learn. Like, okay, what is it about the contrast ratio, where the key light's coming from, how, basically all the little details that make the original shot feel the way it does, and then try to tease out what things to keep and what things to leave behind in order to sort of modernize the effects. And it was really useful. We did a shot from the Hoth battle where we took one of our AT-ATs from Rogue. We painted it up to look like the Hoth AT-ST and AT-AT, and we had AT-STs in Mandalorian, and it's in the back of my brain, so it keeps jumping in there and trying to make me say it. But so we put this second AT-AT in there, painted the same, and we even animated it without motion blur and in a way to look like the stop motion animation from Empire. Again, it was really useful. I mean, this slightly staccato feel of the stop motion animation is not something we'd emulate now. Because it's an artifact. All visual effects have artifacts of one kind or another. Some are good, some are bad. In terms of realistic visual effects, the slightly staccato feel of stop motion was not a good artifact in terms of realistic visual effects. On the other hand, when you're making something like an animated feature using stop motion, it's part of the magic because you've got kind of two threads tickling your brain. One is telling you that these are little puppets that were handmade and you can kind of sense that, and then the other message is that they're alive and you believe in the characters if the film is well made. And that's part of the magic of this kind of surreal, dreamlike magic of stop motion. But in the context of visual effects, it's not so desirable. And so, that's an example where, okay, well, we know what we're not going to carry forward as we do this, but let's look at all the other things that make it feel sort of physical and real and appealing to folks, and in a way that CG sometimes doesn't. So those exercises were super useful. And then, on Mandalorian, of course, we actually went back and built a miniature version of the Razor Crest and sort of went back in time and shot it as a motion control miniature, which is something that's not done very much anymore. So that was really great and really useful. It wasn't just an exercise in sort of nerdy nostalgia techniques that some of us had used earlier in our careers. It really was useful because the spaceships that we're familiar with in Star Wars, like the Millennium Falcon or X-Wings, things like that, we can build those in CG and we know how to make them look just like the models, partly because of that exercise we did on Rogue One, but also just generally we've seen them enough on screen that we know how to light them to make them and texture them and so forth to make them really feel like the miniatures that we're familiar with from the original trilogy. But with the Razor Crest, it had a finish that was unlike any other ship we've seen in Star Wars. It's not as shiny and mirror-like as Padme's. It's not matte and finish like the Star Destroyers or X-Wings or Millennium Falcon from original trilogy. So it was certainly useful to build a model and light it just to see how it reacts to light to inform the textures and lighting of our CG version. But I think it was even really yielded a lot of great creative discoveries and served as a great style guide to go all the way to the extent of putting it in a motion control rig and shooting it that way, rather than just shooting stills of it to use as lighting information. For me, that was tremendously fun, and for John Knoll.
I can imagine. So was it a case of dusting off the old motion control rig and get it all up and running again, or was it a brand new kit?
Brand new. John took it upon himself to design, because we don't have, aside from a few museum pieces that are on display here and there around the company, we don't really have a fully functioning motion control setup here. So John designed one. He designed it in the computer first, and he sourced a bunch of parts that could be bought. And then he's got a pretty well set up machine shop at his home. And so anything he couldn't buy outright, he machined himself and built. And then he wrote his own software to run it.
Wow.
That's John for you. He's got skills of many different kinds. He's a very smart guy. And I think it was probably just super fun for him because he started out, operating motion control rigs of different kinds at ILM. And I did as well, but not at ILM, at Will Vinton Studios. But, it was part of my background too. And we just have that in our blood. And so it was super fun. We had a really good time doing it. And so because he had built the rig in the computer first to kind of design it, I was able to take that geometry, that computer model, and put it in Maya and rig it. And so then I would basically animate any shots that were going to be motion control. I would design them, but I would design them using the motion control rig in Maya rather than just animating the ship wherever. And that way I could ensure that not only was it something that the rig was capable of shooting, that was, of course, the most important thing, but also it enforces a kind of style on you when you do that. And that was part of this whole exercise, was to get at something that felt like it respected the limitations of the equipment that was being used, back on the original trilogy. Yeah. Now, our rig was simpler than theirs, but it could do many of the things that the Dykes Reflex could do, and it served our purposes. And it enforced many of the same kinds of style decisions. So you have to imagine we had about 40 feet of track running diagonally across our motion capture stage. And then mounted on that track was a little carriage that would travel up and down the track. And on that was a pan and tilt head. And then separate from that was a model support, a model pylon, if you will. And it had several degrees of axis. So you'd mount the Razor Crest on that model mover, and it couldn't travel anywhere. It wasn't on a track, but it could move, pitch, yaw, and roll, basically, the three rotational axes. It could do those three things. And so any travel toward and away from camera was done by moving the camera toward or away from the model along its track, and then moving the ship around the frame. Usually we had to do with panning and tilting the camera, rather than, say, moving the camera up or down. And then the ship itself could roll. And you could get a surprising amount of sort of effects from that, and then the ship could be mounted on all six sides, top, bottom, front, back, left, right, had mounting points. So so you had quite a bit of flexibility on the relationship of the model to the camera, and you come up with all kinds of different shots that way. And so I would, animate it in the computer and figure out which way the model needed to be mounted and what lens we're using on our little Canon Mark III, and figure it out that way. And then it would go, those curves from Maya would go off to our motion control rig and drive the actual physical rig, drive the camera down the track as it was photographing the model. And it was super great. There's a whole aesthetic to the original Star Wars miniature shots. And I would say some of that comes from the limitations or what have you of the equipment at the time. In other words, by limitations, I just mean they also had, for instance, about around 40 feet of track, and they had a certain set of lenses, and they were shooting on VistaVision, and their Falcon model in the first film was quite large. It was about 5 feet long. They built smaller models for Empire, and upgraded their equipment and their processes. So, the movement of the Falcon in Empire, of course, is much more free and balletic, if you will, in the asteroid chase, etc., than a lot of the shots in the first film. But we really kind of wanted to mostly make it feel like the first film, but really any of the original trilogy. And so they only had about 40 feet of track. So, for instance, you don't see a lot of shots, almost none, in fact, in the original trilogy of the Falcon coming from way far away and whooshing past camera with the camera panning with it, and then seeing it fly far away from us. You kind of have shots of it coming at us and going over or under past camera, and coming from behind us and flying away from us as pairs of shots. You really don't have single whip pan shots. There's some shots almost like that in the trench toward the end of Episode 4 with some TIE fighters, but even there, they're moving quite slowly relative to camera, and they barely gain on us over the course of the shot. Some of the style of the shots comes from that, what their machine could physically do, their equipment. But I think most of the style of the shots has to do with the fact that George was, had famously used, in lieu of previs, which really wasn't a thing then, footage from, movies with famous aerial battle footage, Battle of Britain and Dam Busters, the most notable examples. And those films featured some stage and miniature work, but they also had a lot of good, especially Battle of Britain, really good actual air-to-air photography, real planes photographed from other real planes. And when you do that, typically what you're doing is you're on a long lens and you're trying to chase this airplane across the sky. And so the aircraft doesn't really move a lot through frame, but the sky is whooshing past in the background because you're sort of tracking it across a big swath of sky and trying to stay framed on it. And that aesthetic, I think, drove the shots in Star Wars more than anything else. Because if you look at any individual shot, typically the ships aren't moving that fast through frame. They're not whooshing past or coming at us at breakneck speed. But the stars are panning behind the ship in an opposing direction in a way that gives the shot a great feeling of dynamism, and it makes you feel like you're shooting it on a long lens and sort of tracking it across space as it moves at high speed. And that aesthetic, in a nutshell, I think gives those shots the feeling that they have more than almost anything else. And the stars are disconnected from the movement of the foreground ship in a way that isn't strictly realistic, but it evokes a certain type of photography that's very exciting. And as well, I think, particularly once they got into the space battle at the end of New Hope, there were other things going on there with the sort of process they had. For instance, they had lots and lots of shots to do and kind of an unprecedented number of optical effect shots. And so one of the things they did to speed that up or help with that was rather than shooting as a bespoke, unique star field motion for every single shot, for many shots, they were able to draw from a library that they created ahead of time. So you had, stars moving from lower left to upper right to upper left, and, south to north movement, and the north to south, and panning left to right and right to left, and probably other variations as well. But, they could look at a shot and say, okay, this will look good with a right to left diagonal. So we'll put that behind this TIE fighter element. And because of that as well, that I think added slightly to the kind of disconnect, but it's a great disconnect. It adds a weird kind of unplanned for level of dynamism to the shots that's just super unique. A big deep dive into all that was super fun for me because I kind of had started that on Rogue, although in Rogue, I have to say, as much as we wanted the ships to feel like the miniature ships in terms of the way we lit them and rendered them, the shot design was pretty modern. We did things that you sort of expect from modern science fiction films in terms of how the camera travels with the ships and the sort of lensing and everything. We didn't go out of our way to make those shots really feel like original trilogy shots. We wanted them to feel modern, but look like sort of like what your mind remembers.
Hello, I'm Warwick Davis, and you're listening to Phantom Tracks.
On Mando, the goal was really to try and make these shots feel as much like original trilogy shots as we could, without going to what I think would be sort of silly lengths, which is like, well, we'll put in matte lines and we'll put in, misregister things slightly. Like, we don't want to go there. We want them to feel credible, and we want you to believe in the world that you're seeing, but we did want that feel. We did allow ourselves to do whip pan shots because they're dynamic and fun, and they show off the Razor Crest. So that was one license we gave ourselves, is we do have shots of the Razor Crest coming at us from a distance, and then we pan with it. And we were able to do that even with our miniature Razor Crest because it was quite a small model. It was only about 2 feet long, so we could do shots like that.
Mark Hamill made a really good point recently in an interview when he said how much he enjoys The Mandalorian, and said that the show to a degree has an advantage over the films because it's so much more focused on the characters, and he was really digging that. Is that one of the provisos that you've got, and that we know ILM could blow our socks off and make visually incredible stuff, but is the focus very much on Mando and the child and the characters, and that the effects just want to bed you into the world? Is that kind of part of the structure of it?
Absolutely. Pretty much exactly as you've said, but also with this, I'd also say with the slight John, I'll come back to Jon Favreau, because I think this goes largely back to him and Dave. I think they're both very concerned about that. But also John's an interesting director in that I noticed this when I first worked with him on the first Iron Man. Animators and previs artists and folks like that are generally very keen to produce effect shots or design effect shots that are cool, right? Really cool and awesome and give you the feels, in a sort of big action sci-fi movie way, because we've all been steeped in those and we kind of know what we feel like is awesome and cool and all that. And John frequently shies away from that. He only wants to use that when it is absolutely story relevant. You know what I mean? He never wants anything that's cool just because it's cool. And then like a much more sort of ordinary example of that is when we're doing sky replacement. You know, frequently if we're doing a whole environment around the characters that didn't exist and it's all CG, you know, we have to discuss at some point what's going on in the sky. And, you know, the mad painters, environment artists frequently want to put in gorgeous looking skies, or at least just really nice looking clouds and things. And John, you know, his mantra is, no, don't do that. If I want a beautiful sky, it's got to be for a moment, you know, a reason in the emotional, you know, narrative of the scene or the episode. Because normally if you're just out shooting stuff outside, you don't get gorgeous skies like that. Yes, you can send a second unit out to wait around all day or all week to get those great shots because maybe you've got a plan for them in your film, but just ordinarily shooting a scene where people are talking and doing things or there's action or whatever that's outside, you're not going to get those amazing cumulonimbus puffy cloud or whatever it is. Yeah. So when people put those in the background of shots that are otherwise a kind of ordinary moment of characters getting from A to B, you know, John is just like, no, take that out. You know, I want to give me a boring sky there. And kind of that way with the visual effects. It's not that he wants boring, but he wants to make sure that cool and awesome isn't getting out in front of serving the narrative tone and realism and believability. Those things are much more important to him. That's a whole aesthetic for him, and that drives it as well. But I think, you know, the main thing is, as you said, is putting the characters front and center, the story front and center, and letting everything else serve that, you know, is always, you know, what we hope to do. We succeed to greater and lesser degree. There are times when I try hard to talk John into something that I think is really cool, that, you know, he may be backing away from. I try.
No, it's a good point. It's a good point because what you've just said really sort of fits the vibe that I get from the show. You mentioned the sunsets. That just feels like a George thing because the only big crazy great sunset I can think of in Phantom Menace, for example, is when Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon have the conversation on the balcony and it felt like a moment. So that kind of very much sort of fits with that. But also in Star Wars, especially in A New Hope, it's the quiet moments. It's Luke and Owen and Beru having breakfast. It's in the garage with his Skyhopper and just the organic, natural sounds, 3PO's gears turning and the sound of the oil bath. And just you feel like you're in the world. And Mando feels like you're in the world.
Yep, I'm with you. And I got to tell you, being on the sets has been super fun because the craft there has been off the charts, really great. And props and costumes and everybody's really done an amazing job. And so it's been a super fun show to just spend time on set because of all the cool stuff everyone's building. And it's, you know, between the volume where we're shooting, where you're wrapped around, you know, amazing imagery, or just the regular practical indoor, outdoor sets. They're nicely immersive and every day is sort of exciting. When I get to be on set, it's super fun in a way that, you know, non-Star Wars films aren't. I mean, I'm almost always excited to be on set, but there's something about these Star Wars projects that's just extra fun because there's quite often along the way there'll be some exciting thing that's happening that like, oh, did you guys see the Blurg motion base? No, you gotta go check that out. Yeah. They're testing it out right now, you know, go on stage 4. And so there's always something cool like that to see and check out, or you know, climb inside the Razor Crest cockpit and just sit there for a moment, have my own, as you say, quiet little moment, Star Wars moment. Yeah. There's not a lot of quiet moments during shooting, but every now and then during the lunch break, you can steal one.
Has The Mandalorian shown then that the demarcation line between movie quality and TV quality is pretty much gone now?
I hope so. I mean, that's certainly our goal. It's funny because going into this, of course, there were naturally discussions about budget and schedule and so forth, as you'd have on any project. And frankly, I'd say one of the very biggest challenges of this show is the volume of work. You know, a big summer tentpole film nowadays generally has around 2,000 visual effects shots, sometimes as many as, you know, 2,500 or whatever. But that's a big Marvel Avengers type of film, just chock full of visual effects shots. A film like that gets done in around a year and a half, what have you, depending on when a visual effects facility is brought onto the project and how many shots they have and all that. We're doing, you know, around 4,000 shots a season for Mandalorian, but we're doing them in around the same amount of time that we do a feature. So we're kind of doing twice as many shots. So I'd say that's the biggest challenge. And so anyway, so going into this, you know, we had conversations about keeping costs down, this and that, because we've got all these shots to do and our budget's only so big and it's television, it's not feature. But in practical terms, I've not noticed any change in how we execute things, how the shots end up looking. In other words, what gets on screen to me looks every bit as good as any other project I've ever worked on at ILM. Probably there's more consideration going into the projects and in prep and ahead of shooting and all that about what can be afforded and all that in budgeting and so forth. But in terms of executing the work, there doesn't there hasn't been any change in like, well, this is for television, so let's not make that last tweak. It'll be fine. And no, every shot gets polished to the same degree, which is fun. I honestly, it would be a bummer if we were put in a box where we had to sort of lower our standards to get something on air. I don't think anybody would enjoy that. And frankly, I think, again, that's what's kept a live action Star Wars series from happening over all these years, is that nobody wanted to do that. Nobody wanted to have it look less than what people think of as Star Wars, because certainly you could make a much less expensive Star Wars TV show, but you would have to cut out a lot of the environments and fantastical places. And it would be more like very much beloved, but much more limited 70s and 80s era sci-fi shows where a lot of the spaceship shots get repeated every episode because they kind of shot a bunch up front for the pilot or whatever, and then they've just sort of banked those and they use the same establishing shots of, for instance, the Galactica over and over again because they can't really afford to shoot bespoke visual effect shots every episode, maybe a few, but not many. I think we're in a blessedly new era because that's the stuff I grew up on. I grew up on sort of expecting a science fiction show to have pretty visible limitations on screen and just, and still cherishing it, still loving it. And if a show had awesome design and of course, good writing and all that could be overlooked. Star Trek, the original series, for instance, for me, or for others, the later series, but for original series, or even Space 1999, the Eagle for me is one of the greatest ship designs of all time. I just absolutely adore the Eagle. And just generally the design aesthetic of Space 1999 particularly. So now we have not only more firepower, but we've got sort of the smarts and the technology to allow us to have a much fuller vision of a science fiction show, but be efficient enough to get it done on whatever budget I guess has been agreed to. And so it's a joy, really. It's great. It's great to have both. It's a golden age of television. You look at everything from, Game of Thrones, the amazing work on that show, to Mandalorian, to Westworld. The visual effects stuff is just really accelerated in the streaming realm. We expect to be doing lots of not just TV series, but streaming films. And, I think that's going to be a big part of our business going forward as a visual effects company.
Hi, this is Vanessa Marshall, and you're listening to Fantha Tracks.
Now that visually, at least, there's pretty much parity, how is a movie going to stand out against a high-quality 8-part series like Mandalorian or whatever else we've got down the horizon? How can a movie now make you go, I'm going to lay down my, $20 or whatever for a ticket and popcorn, and what's the difference now?
I mean, I think one of the things is they can be bigger in scope. I think the sequel films have remained larger in scope than the way Mandalorian feels. And again, that's partly by design. John doesn't want to go, he's not trying to go head to head with the big chapter films. They're their own thing. And he wants to have a different kind of feeling. Because one of the questions that confronts us regularly with visual effects is, how do we get the audience to go, wow, again? Because it used to be, if you go back to 1993, whenever Jurassic Park came out, Jurassic Park is a terrifically crafted film. Obviously, Spielberg's the master, but also in terms of visual effects, it was enough to have a realistic, freestanding, full head-to-toe T-Rex moving around in a way that we'd never seen before to make people go, holy crap, I don't even understand what I'm looking at. How is that possible? Yeah. Now it's very hard to get that reaction from people because they all have a little file folder in their brains that says it was done in a computer. They don't have to have any more details than that. When they see something that's impossible, no matter how realistically it's depicted, rather than going, how can this possibly be, they kind of just go, well, they do that in a computer, which is not a great reaction. So how do you get people to go, that's amazing, this is confusing my senses, I don't understand what I'm saying? Well, I think the onus is back where it belongs on the writer. and the director to imagine scenes and places and events that make people have that sense of wonder and feeling of wonder. So in that way, I think that a small budget film can evoke that. A big budget, massive sci-fi like one of the sequel films can do that. Hopefully our humble little Mandalorian TV show can do that. So to me, that's how you differentiate things. It's got to stem from the ideas, not from the budget or the scope or the polish of the visual effects. I think it comes from the ideas beneath them. And, this is not news. Everyone's been saying this forever, that great visual effects can't save a poorly written film. In fact, they can only slightly harm a well-written film. I always say visual effects are like superpowers for directors. They can be used for good or evil. Great power comes and great responsibility and all that. I don't know. That was a bit of a rambling answer, but I just think for films to differentiate themselves going forward from what people are seeing on a daily basis on their televisions, I mean, maybe there is no difference. There's been an argument for a long time about, should we call this a TV show or a movie? Does it matter? I'm not 100% sure it matters. I'll tell you what does matter to me, and this is sort of relevant to our current circumstances with shelter in place and all this. I love the movie-going experience. I grew up going to movie theaters. I love movie theaters. And I know a lot of people, friends of mine, who grumble about, oh, I hate going to see movies in the theaters now. When people are loud and they take their phones out and their kids make noise and they chew their popcorn and all that. And believe me, I'm a person who at various times in the past has been very annoyed with rude moviegoers and I've been that guy, the really sort of uptight person about my movie-going experience. But I still love it. I still love sitting in a dark theater with a bunch of strangers, especially in comedies and horror films, particularly in those two genres. There's just nothing like it. And it's a communal art experience like no other. And I love it and I value it. So for me, honestly, and that's not even in the hands of filmmakers, but for me, that's the biggest thing that divides the two for me is the viewing experience. And I sure hope that when we come out of the other side of this pandemic, that theater chains are going to be able to reopen and we're going to have access to movies in theaters and not just on our televisions. I watch a lot of, even before this, I watched a lot of movies. Probably most of the movies I watch are on my television, but I still absolutely adore getting out to the theater to see a movie, especially a movie I'm excited about. Like, I can't wait to see Tenet, the new Chris Nolan film. Yeah. And I want to see that in a theater on as big a screen as I possibly can. Hopefully that's all going to come back for us. There's a handful of directors out there that, I see their work and I think, God, geez, I'd like to work on one of those films. He's one of them. Spike Jonze is another one. Fincher, I think it'd be great to work on a Fincher film. There's a bunch of directors. Cameron, I've never worked on a Jim Cameron film. I'd love to work on one of his films. Yeah. But
David Fincher's an ex-ILM guy, isn't he?
Yeah, he was a camera operator on Jedi.
Yeah.
I don't know how long his tenure was. I don't know from what year to what year, but yeah, super young. He was like 18 then or 19, super young.
Yeah.
I've seen with various folks from ILM over the years have collected photos and sort of home movies around the studio, and I've seen some video of him at the studio back then, and he just looks like a kid.
Yeah.
A very talented kid, and I get the impression too that people knew then that he was going places.
Yeah.
That he was extraordinarily talented.
Season 1 of Mandalorian, if there's a moment you could pick, be it a character moment or a moment where all the stars aligned and you go, yep, that nailed it. Could you pick a moment?
I mean, there are a bunch of things I are really pleased with how they turned out. But if I had to pick one or two, certainly the Mudhorn sequence, it was a big, complicated sequence. It's a difficult creature to do. It had the benefit of being a creature for which there's good real world reference, like, rhinoceroses and things. But that also makes it harder because we're familiar with how a creature like that ought to move. So if we don't do it right, people kind of sense that. But it was, woolly and, hair is something we've been doing in CG for a while now, but it never seems to get a lot easier. And it wasn't just furry. It was furry with all different kinds of mud, wet mud, dried caked mud, everything else. It gets singed at one point. There's all this mud interaction splash and getting its sort of final moments right. And the baby using the Force, spoilers, and all those other elements. That was just a tough sequence to get right, and I'm really happy with how it turned out. But I'd say the other thing I think was for me was IG-11.
Yeah.
A great character, lots of fun to figure out how to move it. And I'm just tickled with how it turned out as well. Really great character. And with a great arc over the course of the series as well. So doing the motion control Razor Crest was awesome and fun, and I'm really happy with the results. And the blurgs turned out great, and our little pit droids. Like, pretty happy with the with this. We got to do an ATST. That's a machine I especially love, and so getting a chance to do one of those was really fun. And also, you know, on visual effects on films, there's one director, but on a series of Mandalorian, there can be a bunch. So getting to work with, you know, Bryce and Deb and Dave, Rick, you know, was super great, and Taika as well. And that's really fun. I'd never worked on a TV series before, so getting to know sort of all of them at least a little bit and work with them was super great. That was something I hadn't thought about before jumping into the show. And then I was like, oh, wow. Because as I think I mentioned earlier, like one of my favorite things on a project is getting to know the director. And here I get to meet a whole bunch and kind of learn a little bit from each of them. So it's great.
Without giving anything away, season 2, should we be excited?
Not at all. We've dialed it way back. Yes, absolutely should be excited. It's going to be awesome. It's going to be absolutely awesome. I don't think that's a spoiler. I think I can say that without fear of losing my job. Season 2 is going to be amazing.
That's fantastic. Brilliant. Hal, thanks so much for your time.
You bet.
It's been great to chat, and we'll do it again sometime down the road.
Absolutely. Thanks very much.
Huge thanks once again to Hal for taking the time to be a part of the show. You can catch more audio from Hal and our conversation with him on the next 2 episodes of Making Tracks. Next episode's out on Tuesday and the following episode a week later. If you want to be a part of the action and stay updated on all the latest Star Wars news, visit phantomtracks.com or check out the Phantom Tracks app through the App Store to follow us on your mobile device. You can reach out to us and send in your listeners' questions by emailing radio@phantomtracks.com. Comment, like and share on any of our social media feeds at Phantomtracks, and be sure to subscribe, leave a review, preferably a 5-star one, on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or your podcatcher or smart speaker of choice. Thank you again, and we'll see you on the next studio episode of Making Tracks.
Coming up next on Phantom Tracks Radio, it's another episode of Making Tracks.